Okay, here we go. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How is everyone? I, unfortunately, am a bit under the weather. Picked up a nasty cold from my little one, and I was hoping to be a little more right by the time I was going to be recording this, but I ran out of time. The show must go on, so you're just going to have to forgive me if my voice sounds a little weird, and quite possibly for a potential sniffle. Really, I didn't have much to say this week. I kind of went full on last week, didn't I? There'll be no financial disclosures in this intro. Really, I wanted to read this email that I got this week because it just filled my soul and made me feel that things were okay. So I'm going to read it to you. The subject line says, "You literally changed my life." And the message reads, "I've been practicing for about 2 years. Hot, power, flow, and Bikram have been my focus mainly because it's what my ex taught and all I thought yoga was. Around 6 months ago, I started to dive deeper into my practice. I became interested with Ashtanga, but couldn't find anything around me. So I started looking online and just didn't have the courage to develop my home practice. Mainly because I'm so young in my practice, but also because I didn't want to develop bad habits. I really don't know how I stumbled upon your podcast, but when I say it changed everything, I mean it changed everything. I've had my opinions of what a yogi is, but I've kept them to myself. Listening to you speak about yoga and what it is to you makes me truly believe that I'm walking in the right direction. The way you embrace imperfection, the way you cuss into that microphone, the way you interrupt people, the way you say this is your podcast without actually saying it. For me, it's the greatest metaphor of, this is my practice, take it or leave it. Every fucking episode, you continue to impress me with what you have to say to us yogis. Then the cherry is how you sign off with, be kind. I can't tell you how much that grounds me. I try to be kind every second of the day, but it's so hard because I feel like most people out there could give a fuck about being kind. For a moment, I don't feel so alone. So thanks, brother. But here is how you changed my life. I've been a chef for 18 years. I'm now 36, and my body's falling apart from the long hours and repetition. Yoga has helped my body without a doubt, but more so, it has totally shifted my way of thinking about how my life should be. For so long, I thought that working 14 to 16 a day made me a badass and made me a better chef. What it did was completely burn me out. I felt like a glass jar that maybe at some point had a wax candle in it, but now is just a puddle of used wax with no aroma or purpose. February 2017, I kind of hit my rock bottom. I lost my girlfriend and my job on the same day. A couple of days later, I admitted to myself I was an addict and decided to come clean. Over a year sober now. I dove deep into my practice and quickly realized that yoga is what I wanted my life to revolve around. So I thought maybe I could just teach some kind of yoga and use my food knowledge to educate people while guiding them through their practice. So I started the TT search. Holy shit, there's a lot of shit out there. Not knowing what to trust, I started looking for people that could possibly guide me into the right direction. I think this is how we met. Before I started listening, I started to compare yoga to food and music. I believe you have to know how to cook before you call yourself a chef. 200 hours is enough time to learn how to cut an onion. You have to know your rudiments if you want to teach percussion. 200 hours is an introduction on how to hold a drumstick. So why in the hell am I in such a hurry to get certified to teach? You and your conversations changed my approach in my quest for a teacher training that could actually teach me. It wasn't anything you directly said, but in almost every episode you say something along the lines of the way things used to be. There wasn't 200 hours, you just did it, and then your teacher would say, "You're ready, now teach this class." It makes perfect sense. In the kitchen, one day, it clicked with me. I was ready. I think it took about 6 years for me to get my first original dish on a menu, let alone start managing. I don't know, maybe it's because I feel a little old school too. I feel that an apprenticeship is much more valuable than a 200-hour TT that's in Bali for 21 days, and then I'm off back to the mainland to teach people shit I really don't understand. So literally 1 week ago, I accepted a job in Guatemala to be the chef and garden director for Doran Yoga and Zen Center. That's right, I get to work in a kitchen and a garden, and in return, I get to learn from one very experienced teacher. Not some child that graduated high school while Obama was in office. Eventually, when I'm ready, I can go through his TT. I hope I can stay there and teach and create my own practice, my very own gentle is the new advanced, if you know what I mean. I leave the States at the end of April, and I hope the Wi-Fi is good enough to tune in every Monday for your show. At this point, my heart is pretty overcooked and dry, but I cannot tell you how grateful I am for you and your podcast. I'm not even a teacher yet, but I get it, all of it. I hope someday we can meet and have a face-to-face conversation about some nerdy yoga shit. Until then, be kind. Sal. Oh, Sal, thank you so much, man, for taking the time to write that all. You know, just before I got your email, someone had posted an unfavorable review on iTunes. It's the usual stuff. Jay talks too much. He interrupts his guest. It's all about him. Let the interviewer speak. And I was feeling a little, crap. And then I got your email, man, and it just made everything okay again. So I really hope to meet you too someday, man. Come visit you in Guatemala. We can have a practice together. Thanks so much for getting what this is all about for me. Safe travels, my friend. And what it's all about for me is certainly exemplified in today's episode with Peter Blackaby. Peter's been on the podcast before, about a year ago. You can go back and listen to it. He was coming into town to participate in a symposium at the Breathing Project with Leslie Kaminoff and Amy Matthews. We had a good conversation then. Over the last year, he's been working on a second edition of his book, Intelligent Yoga, which has been released. And he sent me a copy, and it's freaking awesome, you guys. I mean, it's really at the forefront of where I think things need to go. It's totally mind-blowing stuff. So I'm super excited for you guys to hear this conversation that we had today. Before we do, let me mention that this episode of Yoga Talks is sponsored by Karmasoft. If you're not familiar with Karmasoft, I've been talking about it on the podcast. It's a complete online yoga studio management solution. I had a yoga center for 10 years. For 8 of those years, I used this software myself. I can say unequivocally, it is far superior to Mind Body Online. If you or anyone you know is a yoga, Pilates, or fitness center owner, manager, or teacher, and you have to do any scheduling or class payments or accounting, all of it can be made far easier and more efficient by using Karmasoft. I had the founder of Karmasoft, Rudy Senecal, on the podcast back in October 2017. I encourage you to go listen to it. Rudy is a pretty special guy. The way he runs his business is pretty special. I simply can't recommend it enough. Use Karmasoft. You can find it at karmasoftonline.com. Let me also drop my stuff here. I am going to be in Fishkill, New York, April 14th. I'm going to be in Falls Church, Virginia, April 27th through 29th. I am going to be in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, May 5th and 6th. And I believe there's still some of the discounted spots left. If you use code Brazil20, you can get 20% off that gig in Brazil on May 5th and 6th. Also, I am starting one of my teacher training programs here locally in Easton, Pennsylvania, May 12th. You can find out about all those gigs and more. You can listen to the archives of this podcast and read my blog and find my online yoga video offerings, including my live stream subscription with 24-hour access. All of that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. If you have been enjoying the podcast and you wouldn't mind showing a little bit of support, 2 good ways to do that. One, go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation. That is profoundly helpful. Two, non-financial, you can just go to Apple Podcasts and iTunes and write a review, give us some stars. That's real helpful too. We really appreciate your support. Okay, I have kind of a surprise type guest coming on next week. I will tell you who it is on the other side. But for now, let's get to it. Let's listen to this talk I had with Peter Blackaby.
Hi, Jerry.
Hey, Peter. How's it going with you today?
Yeah, it's pretty good. You know, we're just getting to the edge of the book. It's been printed now. There's, you know, the hassle of delivering them and logistics of... You always forget that when you write a book, that actually there's the physical side of it's got to be done at the other end, you know, printing and binding and checking. And
did you go through like a publisher and go that route and have to deal with all that?
Well, I've got she's a one-man band publisher. She's starting Cassiter Press. She's done a couple of books, and I'm the third one, and she's setting off on the publishing trail. But I've had to do most of the financing, and she's done all the organising and the artworks, and you know, and I'm very pleased with it. She's really good. She does, you know, she does our kind of yoga, so it was very useful in that sense. That in the first edition, that the publisher didn't really understand what I was getting at, whereas Anna, who's publishing it, is well up to speed with what I'm teaching. And so had a better way of critiquing it, of putting me straight, telling me when I was clear, when I wasn't. And that was really helpful.
Yeah, I know. I've been sort of exploring publishing options for some things that I'm working on. And it just seems like some of what we're interested in is too much of a niche market for like big-time publishers or something to be interested in.
Yeah. I'm hoping that, and it might work this time, because my first edition sold pretty well.
Yeah.
And if the second edition starts off pretty well, we might be able to pick up a publishing detail, you know.
Yeah.
Deal on the back of it.
Well, I've had a chance to look through it, and I read a fair amount, not its entirety, but it's pretty great, Peter. I really love the book. And I mean, I know you had it out before. This is a second edition, right?
Yeah. It's quite a bit changed from the first edition.
Yeah, you talk about that right at the beginning in your kind of introduction to it, that your thinking has evolved since then.
That's right.
Which is also cool because it's a funny thing that's been happening with the podcast. You're one of a small group now of people who are coming on for the second time. And it seems like it's just happening totally not by design, that I tend to have the second conversation with them almost exactly 1 year later. So it was this month last year that our first podcast together posted out, which was a month in advance of the Beyond Anatomy Symposium at the Breeding Project that you were at.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's wild. I love the way it sort of like marks time for me, some of these podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so here we are now, and a lot's happened in the last year. For me, for the Breeding Project, I bet for you too.
Sure.
And I also just want to say, like, I want to take a personal moment here right at the beginning. Back at that time when our episode came out, I was actually going through a rough period of time, and I had talked on the podcast about some pain issues. And there was like a moment where you reached out to me, and you thought back to a time in your life. And I remember you even saying when you would sneeze and your back would go out.
Yeah.
And it was helpful to me, that note, so I really appreciated it. Thanks, man.
You're very welcome.
And you know what I would say is, now it's a year later, and those pain issues have largely passed. I mean, they're still in there somewhere, but they were addressed, and a lot of it was changing my situation more than like trying to manipulate my body, you know?
Yeah.
Which went to our conversation.
Exactly,
yeah.
The more I realized that, you know, long pain is to do with people's lives. You know, it's not just to do with bodies. Yeah, it's such an important understanding.
Yeah. All right, well, let's talk about your book some, because I really enjoyed it, and you've been on the podcast before, so we like did your whole bio and stuff like that. So we don't need to do that again.
Okay.
we could just get into some of the stuff that you're talking about and some of the stuff that I find really intriguing and exciting. So, first of all, your first edition of Intelligent Yoga, and I'm just kind of looking at the intro that you sent me, which was super comprehensive. You said that you had like two main themes. Yeah. And one of them was that you wanted to reframe yoga some in a more like modern Western context. And you specifically say out of cultural, like Hindu cultural notions. Yeah. Which is a very interesting thing in and of itself. And of late there's even been like some hubbub.
Oh, a lot of hubbub. Yeah. I seem to have walked into a minefield there. But I stand by it. The yoga's been in the West for a while now. And I think we all kind of rail and are surprised and raise our eyebrows at some of the excesses of modern yoga that you see around. Beer yoga, yin and jin yoga, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of nonsense yoga. But I actually think it's a very small group of people who are doing the kind of extreme nonsense yoga. I don't know anyone who's ever been to a beer yoga class, and I certainly don't know of any classes like that around. And then there's the bigger question of the commodification of yoga. Buying £500 yoga tops, and again, I guess that's the thing you're trying to nail there. Isn't really yoga, is it? It's monetization of anything. The music industry, yoga, whatever it is. The money men often bring it down to the lowest common denominator, and I think we all agree that that's not a good thing. For me, yoga is it's about three main things. It's a physical practice, it's a contemplative practice, and it's a self-reflective practice. And in that practice, things about the human being change. And the politics that swirls around at the moment is politics, and I don't see it as yoga at all. People weaponize, monetize, politicize something that is actually a personal practice. And, for me, I've got to understand yoga through the lens of the culture in which I live. I would actually say it's disingenuous to try and see yoga through a lens of a culture that I didn't grow up in, I don't understand fully, and I doubt whether anyone who didn't grow up in it really could understand it fully. I think it's always a hard job. I think we should try. I think we should try and empathize and sympathize and see the struggles of other people's other cultures. But I'm a man born in the southeast of England and grew up, born in 1954. So the only culture I really understand is mine. Mm-hmm. And so the genuine thing for me, if I want to be authentic in my yoga, is to reframe it as best I can without losing my integrity through that lens. And, that might mean changing a language, but I'd do that if something was written in German. If I was teaching English people, I'd change the language so that my audience could understand it. Mm-hmm. And, that's how I see it.
What I think is interesting is that normally when you talk about reframing yoga away from its Hindu cultural notions, the sort of assumption, and I think like a lot of the knee-jerk Facebook comments that happen, is that means that you're now just trying to like sell yoga as physical exercise only, or as like that beer yoga or whatever like you're talking about. Like there's this, if it's not connected to Hinduism, that means commodification. Yeah. But your other main theme is about like how profound the investigation of the human condition is, which to me is very, and we talked about this last time you were on the podcast, very like mystical. So you're in no way, by reframing it, you're in no way like taking away, making it just like physical exercise. You're still kind of, for me, keeping this magic, which is an interesting idea that yoga still has this like profound thing about it, but it doesn't have to mean Hinduism.
Well, we're all human beings, and if you think yoga is a practice, human beings will experience change if they practice in a particular way. It doesn't matter what kind of human being you are, whether you're a white, black, Hindu, Christian, secularist. The capacity to self-reflect, to move, to notice, to pay attention changes one, regardless of the culture. That's beyond culture. The context in which we situate yoga is, I think, up to us. The practice is the same or similar. It may, change slightly from place to place, but as far as I understand it, the capacity to notice how we are in the world and how we respond to the world, and a deepening of that process is what makes it yoga and not exercise or something else, and whether I speak in Sanskrit, English, German or Double Dutch is irrelevant. It's the practice I'm interested in.
Yeah, me too. And I know that there are certainly Hindu teachers who taught my teachers that we're supposed to make it specific to our culture,
Yeah.
So,
indeed. I mean, it was certainly brought over by some teachers to help us with that.
Yeah.
The great gift I think yoga has given a lot of Western people is the capacity to introspect. We didn't do that very well in the West. We were good at science and all the stuff outside, and we built great machinery and smartphones and whatever it is. But we didn't do so good on the, how do we feel? How do we relate? What is it like to be connected to other human beings? That's the gift that I think yoga has given us. And it would be a terrible shame if anyone tried to take that away from people who need it.
Well, the other idea that's really been on my mind, and which the recent hubbub has been around, Theo Wildcroft's term post-lineage yoga. Because what we're talking about is absolutely what she's talking about. It's like this intersection between the roots, the lineage traditions, and then on the other side's commodification, and somewhere in the middle is where we're all landing,
Yeah,
But
exactly.
some people seem to think that is somehow an affront to the lineages, and I don't hear that from her, and I don't hear that from you. There can still be a due reverence for these traditions of practice that passed the batons to all these other teachers, or these lineages that are the roots of yoga.
Yeah, we stand on the shoulders of giants,
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
And you can't, I would certainly not interested at all in denigrating anyone who has a lineage and looks backwards. I mean, in a sense, we all have a lineage. My teachers were influenced by Vanda Scaravelli, who was influenced by Inga, who was influenced by Krishnamacharya, who knew we go back and back.
Right.
But I am interested now in the more horizontal distribution of knowledge. The sharing of it sideways rather than the vertical transmission. I'm more suspicious of that. I mean, we see so many failings of people who set themselves up as masters and then fail. Discussion, debate, continuing, checking on each other, checking in. How are we doing? It seems the way that it will work better in the Western culture or in where we are. When Western people set themselves up as gurus, it often seems to end in disaster.
Well, also, even when Indian people have set themselves up as gurus, it seems to be ending in some disaster too, in all fairness. I think it's always that, like you say, this top-down versus horizontal thing.
Yeah.
I've been really thinking about that too, which is a good transition to the new edition of Intelligent Yoga. And I just want to say I gave you some shit about Intelligent Yoga, as a word choice last time you were on the podcast. But I want to say that the book totally lives up to its name. It's a really great book. I'm totally cool with the name because it's in an incredibly intelligent way that you've laid it out.
Thank you.
And so one of the things that you mentioned that has evolved in your thinking, you say it's a twofold difference, and one of them is that no living thing exists in isolation, which seems to me to point to this more horizontal thing, not just in the way we experience in practice, but also in how we teach.
Yeah. I mean, it's once you start going down that line of thinking. I mean, of course, I first started thinking about those kind of things, almost in an anatomical sense. I was trained and taught as an osteopath and as a Iyengar teacher to look at particular parts of the body, a hip or a muscle or a bit of fascia or something. And after a while, you realize that's a crazy notion. There are no bits of the body that exist in isolation, that they're always in conversation with another part of the body. And then I realized, of course, that you as a human being are always in contact with other human beings and responding and reacting, and your body is changing because of those responses and reactions. So the lives we've lived shape us and continue to shape us, and the way we change through our self-reflection would change the way we respond to the world, and we will change other people through that. And hopefully, if we reflect well, in a very positive way. And, of course, then you can go further and recognize that people in relationship exist in an environment, and the way we treat the environment will have huge repercussions on how well we live our lives and how happily we live our lives, and how we treat animals. There is no end, once you start looking at the relationship instead of the things. And I think that's been something really that's been on my mind. It's so easy to identify a thing, a muscle, and blame that, or another person and blame that, instead of really looking carefully at how am I relating to this thing, this person, how are my muscles relating to a movement, how am I relating to my environment. Once you start thinking like that, your frame of reference changes, and things start to, in a funny sort of way, become simpler. Because if you're just looking at things all the time, you're shooting the messenger quite often. You're putting the blame at the wrong address, and it doesn't really work. And you usually wind up in more conflict and more problems.
I've certainly experienced what you're talking about in certain ways, but I feel it's a very big shift of perception or something, because I still feel like there's this idea, like there's a lot of talk of like a holism or holistic ideas in yoga, but then there's also this it's not new, but we talked about it last time you were on, there's this wanting to look through yoga through this like scientific lens. And so it sort of seems to me that in practice, you still see a lot of like hip opening workshops or like targeting of this or targeting of that even though people want to embrace this holistic idea that it's all about an interrelatedness, and yes, if I look at how I relate to things, that'll change stuff, there's still this default setting of like targeting our bodies like they're like cars that need to be tuned up or something.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about, structuralism, really, and the way we look at the biomedical model of but even if you think, it's interesting that you said that was more scientific, and I understand what you mean. Often this comes from people who have some knowledge in medicine, and medicine is scientific. But science has moved on, and complexity theory, chaos theory, the whole notion that of interrelatedness is becoming much more of an accepted scientific idea. Sorry, my phone is
that your Alexa interrupting our podcast recording?
Just my phone singing, and suddenly Siri starts speaking to me.
See, man, this freaking AI shit's weird. I'm not getting any of those freaking Alexa boxes that sit on your table and talk to you. That just freaks me out, man.
Yeah, me too. That was just an iPhone just started talking to me.
See, that's weird, man. Your iPhone just started talking for no reason, man. Anyways.
Yeah, probably disagreeing with what we're saying.
Well,
so I think if you think about the way we think about ecosystems now, we it's very interesting how ecologists talk about rewilding to get a better balance in nature. That we think more in medicine about diet and exercise and movement and all these kind of things. It's not taking a pill to solve that problem or the technical fix that we used to think of in science. I think science is interestingly moving into a more holistic and integrated phase. We know that looking linearly in a complex world doesn't really work. And it's true of yoga. Linear, sort of trying to solve a problem by working on a muscle is grossly simplifying a relational problem. or a relation.
Can you explain what a mereological fallacy is?
Yeah, well, the mereological fallacy, yeah. I came across that term a few years ago listening to a philosophy podcast. A philosopher called Ron Harris was talking about neuroscience, and he was talking about people, it's just saying that the lateral cingulate in the brain is the place where we remember people's faces. And he picked this neuroscientist up and he said, well, that's not true, is it? He said, if you took the lateral cingulate out of a brain, it couldn't do anything at all. A human being remembers faces. And, of course, the lateral cingulate is involved, but so are so many other parts of the brain. So is the other person that you're remembering, the person you're talking to. There's a whole series of things, apart from that part of the brain, that remembers something. And so the mereological fallacy is when we give a part of a body or a part of something the value of the whole thing. So if I say, my bicep is the flexor of my elbow, it's a mistake in thinking, because the bicep has no ability to do anything on its own. It's only part of a whole gamut of things that happen, from me having an idea to do something, to bend my elbow, to other muscles that need to relax, a whole shifting of weight when I do that, lots of proprioception that's involved. And to simplify it down to a muscle is just a mistake in thinking. That there is, it's always a whole body process, whatever you do. I have an intention to do something, and my muscles will act that intention out. There is never a muscle that's making a decision. There's me, Peter Blackaby, making a decision. My muscles perform the decision. And it's a kind of horse before the cart thinking, to think that my muscles are somehow performing the action. Peter Blackaby is performing the action, or Jay Brown is performing the action. The muscles are the actors in the piece, that's all. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I've always said that it seemed to me that in the West, we were kind of trained that in order to learn something, we had to break it apart into its smallest parts and name them all.
Yeah.
That there was some things that maybe you couldn't understand them by doing that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that we're still in it. I mean, I'm interested that you say that, and I've heard this from some other people, that the science is getting away from kind of a Western reductionist view of anatomy.
Yeah.
But it's still, in the yoga world, there's still largely a reductionist view about anatomy.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I see it all the time, and look on. I quite often get people, emailing me and saying, "What do you think about this clip, this YouTube clip, or that?" And it's someone doing a, work for the core or a hip opener, as you say. And I just, in life, that's not how we function. We function as whole human beings in action. And when people argue, and this often comes back to me, they say, well, what happens if I've got weak abdominal muscles? Shouldn't I strengthen them? Mm-hmm. And the answer is you should try and understand what it is about your life that's allowed the abdominal muscles to become weak, and make sure that your life becomes more active, so you involve them more. Not to...
You mean Navasana is not going to do it, Peter?
Well, all it will enable you to do is Navasana,
Yeah.
Because when we train a muscle, it's a very specific act. If you train your quadriceps to cycle, it doesn't make you a better runner. And if you train your legs to do, squat thrusts, it will make you very good at squat thrusts, but it won't make you a better cyclist. And there's loads of studies that back that up.
Well, I want you to know, Peter, like last time you came on the podcast, you said something that completely blew my mind, that I continue to say in many classes and quote you since. And I had already been having some issues with triangle pose,
Yeah.
But after my conversation with you, I still teach it some, but I have to use all these disclaimers and do all these different things to make me feel okay about it. Because this one bit that you said about if you're going to teach yoga to a horse, you wouldn't teach it side splits.
Yeah.
That thing, it just makes it clear for people in terms of this idea of what's really functional and why we would be trying to do certain things with our bodies in yoga practice,
Yeah, you have to first. I mean, that's for me. That's the bottom rung of yoga teaching. The first thing you have to assess if you're going to ask people to do things, you've got to ask yourself, how do I know whether this is useful for human beings? And I think I probably said last time, there are about 3 places you can look. You can look at human evolution, and I doff my cap to Serge Grakovetsky here, who really helped me think about that. He showed me how spines work, how they evolved, what they were used for in locomotion and movement, and you can extend that. You can do some anthropology. You can look at how people move, who haven't been educated in yoga and health and safety. And you can look at childhood development. You can see, well, how do babies learn to move and get onto 2 feet and move around? And you can, none of them are getting their legs behind their heads. So, it's
babies sometimes just naturally, because they're so, when you change them, their legs go back like that, but they're not trying.
No, what babies are doing is they're mapping their bodies, and that's a big step in my thinking. What I'm interested now is how do we map movement richly enough in our bodies so that we are enabled to do what we want to do. Because, the old structural idea is that the reason we can't do something is because our muscles are too weak, we're too stiff, not strong enough, whatever it is, we lack flexibility. Mm-hmm. Of course, that might be in a few cases the case, but by and large, it's a lack of mapping. In other words, we can only perform a movement if our sensory motor cortex has that movement mapped. And the way I explain that and try and clarify that is I usually get people to put their hand on the floor or on a table or something and get them to lift their fingers individually, and they can all do that. And then you get them to put their foot on the floor and ask them to lift their toes individually. And of course they can't do that. And it's not because the muscles are weak, and it's not because the muscles are too stiff, because you can lift all the toes together, you can flex all the toes together. It's because you haven't got a map for individuality. And if you didn't have any arms, you would practice using your feet until you had the maps. And if you ever look at people who have been born without arms, they have very well mapped feet, and their feet act like hands.
Yeah, you talk about those people who can walk through a forest and make no sound.
Yeah, exactly. If we grew up in that kind of environment, a hunter-gatherer environment, our bodies would be so well attuned to the environment because evolutionary pressure would have necessitated it. The difficulty for a modern human being is that there is no pressure to perfect movement or, proprioception. I can be a really incompetent mover and survive very well. And with that incompetence comes, in the end, as we get older, a lack of moving, and the lack of movement is associated with increased arthritis, increased muscular problems, pains and aches. If we don't move fairly regularly, we slowly lose the maps and the ability to do the things we did when we were young. And people always say, oh, I'm getting old, but actually what they do, they stop doing things.
Because there's pain. I know. And the other thing is, now that sometimes we've lost the maps for movement, It seems like this reductionist idea that's so ingrained, entrenched is maybe a better word. It makes it harder for people to regain the maps or discover the maps that they were never given. Maybe
Well, what is the point of the map for Parapuna Navasana? It's a map I would never use.
Yeah.
So. I don't see the point in teaching it. It's that kind of view of looking at the.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was also thinking about more the way you talk about this a little bit in your book. I think about when they started giving MRIs for people who didn't have pain.
Sure.
And seeing that these ideas that we have about certain things that can come up in an MRI being the reason for someone's experience are not really as linear and solid and true as it's being made out to be often. I feel like I'm often up against that. When people come, there's this idea about their bodies and what they're going to do to it that you have to kind of address. It seems like that's where your book starts. You kind of have to address that first before you can get to any of the other stuff.
Well, I agree. Particularly if you're dealing with people with pain, one of the first things you have to slowly do is reframe that relationship to their perceived notion of what's wrong with them. It's true, obviously, if we've just just over a week ago, I fell over walking my dog, and I landed very painfully on my ribs, and I was limping around for a few days.
Sorry, Nate, you're all right.
Yeah, I'm getting better. But, for a few days, I could hardly breathe. And then, your body starts to heal, and, I'm 10 days on from it now, and it's virtually gone, and I'm back to normal. So that's the process that should happen. If that doesn't happen, and I think I have confidence in moving because, it's my life, it's what I do. So as soon as my body started to feel better, I started to do more. And in the doing more, you kind of remapping, you're changing your relationship to the pain. You're noticing, I think it's a bit better. I'm doing a bit more today than I did yesterday. We notice all those things, and we notice them as improvement, and our expectation changes. And my expectation then becomes, a few days' time, we continue like this, I'm going to be fine. But if you're not someone who does yoga, if you're someone who's fallen over and you really hurt yourself and you're limping around, and actually you start thinking, I think I better stop moving because it hurts so much, and you spend 2 or 3 weeks being unwell and ill and not moving, then things drag on, and after a while you start to habituate the pain and the lack of movement, and you lose your maps for movement, and you retreat into immobility, and that's how people get old.
And interesting, because I remember I've often heard people say, like, yoga stops the aging process, which I think is a pretty too broad claim, but in that sense what you're saying would maybe be true in some regard, that continued inquiry into your own movement maps would potentially be a way to address what you just said about getting old,
Well, I'm sure my Thursday morning yoga class won't mind me talking about them because, I've got people in their 70s and 80s in that class who I've been teaching for 20-odd years. And we do, in my classes and all my classes, we do repetitive, normal human movement kind of yoga. I don't do anything extreme. I don't do anything excessive. I do no yoga exotica. But we put the body through twists and forward bends and small back bends. We sit on the floor. We get up from the floor. We straighten our legs. We bend our legs. And we do it every time. And that's their practice. And these people are still, at 80 doing what they were doing when they were 60. It's very heartwarming to see.
Yeah.
And, I would say if you work like that, if you're not torturing your body, if you're not straining it, if you're not pushing it to the end all the time, bodies go on for a very long time. They're pretty resilient.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, though, I'm sitting here thinking right now because one thing that I've been doing, and I've been talking about on the podcast a lot, I think it's maybe a good example for us in this conversation, again, is I mentioned to you last time you were on, I was having these pain issues that had to do with too much extension in my spine, too much movement that was causing chronic inflammation, I think. And one of the things that I've been doing that has really helped is pull-ups.
Pull-ups?
Never done pull-ups in my life, really. I was at a playground with my daughter. Yeah. I tried to do a pull-up, and I was shocked by how weak I felt. Uh-huh. So I just got myself a pull-up bar. And I don't, I started just doing 3 a day.
Yeah.
And then now sometimes it'll be 5, sometimes more. It just depends on how I feel.
Yeah.
And I definitely feel like it causes me to engage these muscle groups in this action that I just didn't have in my life previously because it wasn't in my yoga anywhere to do that.
All right.
And I feel like that action, that pulling action, has definitely feel like it's firmed up something, where that areas that were too much movement seem to have sturdied a little, and the pain is definitely less because of that. But I wonder how much of that is the muscles working and firming it up, or just my nervous system responding to that activity.
I would wager on the latter.
I knew you were going to, which is why I brought it up.
I tell you, if you've got a chin-up bar, because we've got one in our house too. My son uses it. I occasionally use it. There's one really, nice thing to do is that when you, I don't know if I can describe this, if you, rather than doing a chin-up, is to bring your feet through your arms, So if you're hanging onto a bar, you're going to do a pull-up and you swing your feet up and through your arms, not down on the other side necessarily, but just do that a few times. That's a very nice sort of movement for flexion and flexion of the shoulders, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I will play around for sure.
Yeah, it's more whole movement. I like it.
Yeah.
You know? It was the kind of movement you do if you were kind of climbing a tree and you wanted to swing your legs up to a branch that was a bit higher up, that kind of a movement. And where you're using the whole body. You're not just letting the body dangle and bring yourself up, with your arms. You're using your body to do something else. That's quite fun.
I get it, but I guess my question is, part of me still feels like there's a muscular engagement that's having an effect. But I also know better in a certain sense that it is ultimately about my nervous system, which is why I asked the question like that.
Yeah,
and that's the mind switch that has to happen, right?
I would argue. I mean, I suspect I'll still be arguing this in 10 years' time, but I might not, of course. But in my current understanding, what we're doing all the time. I mean, the tone a muscle has, the relationship to movement that it has is only there because of neurological mapping. It's got nothing to do with the muscle is strong or weak. It's whether it knows what to do. And it can only know what to do through practice and repetitive practice.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.